Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kevin Bosch. I'm the chair of the Pearson Centre. So thank you very much, everyone, to come joining our session on transitions and the challenges and opportunities with transitions. It's a rather interesting time in Ottawa right now. I'm well aware there's a transition going on in the Vatican right now. Apparently white smoke has been sighted. So I will, Indira, I'll text you the name of the new Pope once I learn it, so you can announce it live on the webinar if you like. Very delighted to have a distinguished panel with us today. I think I'll start off with Pam Damoff. So Pam is, I'm delighted to say, our new president and CEO of the Pearson Centre. Folks will know Pam was a city councillor in Oakville, was a longtime member of parliament for Oakville North Burlington, parliamentary secretary, and we are beyond thrilled that she will now be providing leadership for us here at the Pearson Centre. So thank you, Pam, for joining us. We're equally delighted to have Michael Wernick with us today. Michael has a 38-year career in government service, ending up as the 23rd Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to Cabinet. Now he is a Senior Strategic Advisor at NMP Inc. and also the Jarislowsky Chair at the University of Ottawa. So we're beyond thrilled to have Michael join us and provide incredible insight into how things work in governments, particularly in times of transition. And moderating us today is none other than Indira Naidu-Harris. Couldn't have a better moderator. Indira, most people know, has a long career in broadcast journalism, was an Ontario MPP and a minister in the Liberal government there. So we have the best people in Canada, quite frankly, to talk about these things. So in a few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Indira. I know that we are going to spend some time getting questions from you folks. So there is a question box, a question function attached to the application. So if you do have questions that come to mind, please type them in there, and then we'll get them to Indira. So with that, I'm going to go off screen, and I'll just turn it over to you, Indira. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be here with you all today for this important conversation about the challenges and opportunities of transition. As you heard, my name is Indira Naidu-Harris, and I'm your moderator today. Now, shaping a new government after an election is not an easy matter. It's a bit of an adventure, I think, an adventure in meeting legislative and political imperatives and having all those things line up with complex timetables. You see, there are a number of important elements to consider when our country transitions from one government to the next. Things like the structure and the size of the next cabinet, along with who will be part of that cabinet, and of course, what will be the government's priorities for the coming years, and how to make all those things fit into a tight schedule with an eye on the future. It's a tall order, and one that is being made even more complicated this year, because this is a minority government, and Mark Carney's Liberals are facing some of the toughest challenges to our country in decades. Donald Trump's repeated threats to make Canada the 51st state, his imposition of sweeping 25% tariffs, and rising global instability and uncertainty about our allies are creating serious challenges for Canadians and making our future uncertain. So today, we are going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of transition. That's where we are. How is this government going to navigate through these difficult decisions? And what exactly is happening right now behind the scenes? What's it like? What's going on to support folks as they get ready? After all, the decisions being made today will affect millions of Canadians and the future of our country. No question, there's a lot at stake. Now, as you heard, we have some very special guests with us today to help us answer some of these questions. So let's get started. Our first guest, as you heard, is the former clerk of the Privy Council and current Jarislowsky Chair of Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa, Michael Wernick. Michael is Canada's former top bureaucrat, and he understands well the challenges and opportunities that Prime Minister Carney and his team are facing right now as they work furiously to put in place a solid new government. Welcome, Michael. Also joining us today. is former MP and the new CEO of the Pearson Centre for Progressive Policy, as you heard, Pam Damoff. And we are so excited to have you in this role, Pam. Pam, again, represented the riding of Oakville North Burlington and also sat on several committees and was the vice chair of the Status of Women Committee and also was parliamentary secretary to a number of ministers, including Health, Indigenous Affairs, Public Safety, and Foreign Affairs. So, as I said earlier, Pam and Michael, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks
Michael,
a lot, Indira.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. So let's just get to it. Tell me, what do you think are the biggest challenges and issues facing this new administration? And what advice do you have for the Prime Minister and his team as they prepare to tackle them?
Well, I think right now we're in the sort of startup and setup phase of the government, positioning themselves to be able to take on these challenges. So I'll come back to your question, but these early days of sort of choosing personnel, deciding who's going to be in what role, stocking up with political staff, and deciding on your decision-making structures and processes, how cabinet's going to be organized, what kind of committees and focal points are going to be. They imprint your government for quite a long time. You can always later shuffle ministers and you can reorganize cabinet. But what I've found is governments sort of settle into a way of being, a way of working that imprints for pretty much the rest of the government. So I'm actually keeping an eye on some of that. They don't have a lot of time to tackle the actual sort of policy issues. Let me just take a little sidebar as a professor and define terms for a second. I mean, there are different kinds of handoff of power from one government to another. You've seen the kind where there's a change of leader and they take on the position and there's a sort of a reboot. Mr. Carney did that in March. They're doing that in Newfoundland and Labrador this week. So there is a sort of a kind of transition there. You have governments that are re-elected after an election. They still go through a reboot and a sort of renewal and have fresh personnel. They would have done that in Ontario earlier this year. This kind of full-blown after an election regime change transition, we don't do very often. This will be the 5th in about 45 years. So it's a big deal and it's it's really very exciting to be part of it. The first wave where we are right now is very, very heavy on personnel. It's not just deciding the 25 or 30 people that will go into cabinet, but there's a cascade from that. Let's say 25 ministers. That means 25 parliamentary secretaries, about 25 chairs of House of Commons committees. And what you won't see is trying to recruit and plug in somewhere around 300 political staff who play an absolutely critical role. Like each minister is going to have 4 or 5 key people. MPs are going to have, a key team that Pam can speak to, and both in Ottawa and in their constituencies. The Prime Minister is going to have to decide who comes into the PMO out of the campaign team. It can be a different crew than it was in March. So, I think this is very, very heavy on personnel, at the moment. For the public service, there's a very small sliver of people working close to the Prime Minister on cabinet structures, what's going to be on the Prime Minister's agenda in the early days, maybe starting to work through a legislative agenda and that sort of thing. But actually, a lot of the transition is borne by the political side. I would say, people are already working on the budget. They're already working on a speech from the throne. Right. They're mapping out first moves in a parliamentary agenda. And the challenges would just come pouring in every day.
Yeah. So really, you're saying one of the things you're laying out right now is one of the biggest challenges that is on the plate for the Prime Minister and his team is really figuring out who those folks are going to be and how all of these various pieces are going to be able to fit together. So, just to circle back to my original question, advice? What advice do you have for the Prime Minister as they're trying to figure out what this team looks like, who they are, and who's going to be where, and how those pieces are going to work?
Well, I haven't been asked for any, and I don't really offer any. He knows his people. He knows his candidates and his MPs. He knows the people that got him the leadership campaign and so on. I would just say, my general advice is put your strongest players in the most important files.
Right.
The things that are the highest risk or the highest degree of difficulty, put your talent there. And I would say in a minority parliament, and I know we'll come to this later, in a minority parliament, two of your key players are your House Leader and your Whip. If you're going to make this parliament last more than a few months, you need people with real political and people skills in the role of House Leader and Whip.
Love it. So you're saying put your strongest people in the most important roles and think about those right away. Pam, you have been on the inside. What do you think are the biggest challenges right now facing this administration? And we'll get to more detail later, but what advice do you have for them to help them get ready?
For the Prime Minister's office, Indira, or for MPs in general, or
Either
everybody?
one, whatever you feel comfortable talking about, but maybe for MPs. Sure.
I mean, for MPs, it's a steep learning curve if you've never been there before. And over a third of those elected to this new parliament are new. You've got to hire up an office, and the people that worked on your campaign are not necessarily the best people to be working in your MP office. You need to staff up a local office. In some cases in rural ridings, it's more than one office locally. You need to staff up your Ottawa office, and you really need people that bring different skill sets to it. Then add on the layer of, the Prime Minister looking to who's going to be in cabinet. You're going to bring back experienced cabinet ministers. You're also going to bring in new people who've never even sat in Parliament before. So they don't know how committees work. They don't even know how the House works. And Indira, you would have experienced this when you were at Queen's Park. Nobody can really explain how it all works until you're actually sitting there. And there's a lot to go through. I do have confidence in the Prime Minister's ability to manage all of this, but Parliament is very different than running a business or running even the Bank of Canada. And you have people with personalities whose egos are going to be hurt if they don't get put in cabinet or they don't get made a parliamentary secretary. And caucus relations is going to be incredibly important for him. And he's going to, I hope, put strong people in place to manage caucus. And also, I hope that he does leave the door open to listen to caucus, because quite frankly, those MPs are the ones that have their ear to the ground in their ridings. And I would say that during our the last 10 years, we got further and further away from listening to caucus. And it can prevent problems before they happen if you're having an open and honest dialogue with your caucus where they genuinely feel heard. But for those new MPs, it's like drinking from a fire hose. You're basically now a small business owner. You're responsible for your own office budget. You're responsible for hiring, firing, figuring out what office supplies, things that MPs don't think about, to be honest, when you're running. And all of a sudden you get put into this position. And I would say for an MP, the most important position they can fill right away is they're getting a good chief of staff who can then help you manage the rest of the process. If you don't have a good chief of staff, and that doesn't mean the best person on the campaign, it means somebody that can manage people, that has a sense of how Ottawa works, because it's very different than knocking on doors. So lots of things to deal with.
Really great advice, and thank you for that. Just further to that, you've touched on a lot of these things, but I understand that class is in session right now for rookie MPs. Any thoughts about that and what that entails? I think it's probably a really helpful support to folks.
Yeah, no, they didn't do that when I got elected, and I was happy to see that, but it depends on what they're teaching them. So if, there's so much that you have to learn about the administration of your office. But I know for myself, and Indira, you and I were talking about this earlier this week, nobody told us how committees work. And nobody told us how, statements in the House can be a really effective way of highlighting people and organizations in your riding. And I remember we did not do very well when we first sat down in committee. We were terrible, as a matter of fact. So, nobody sort of went through how committees work, what committees do. The first bill that we did, we deleted a clause by mistake, and the government had to put it in when it came back at report stage. And so I do hope that there's a little bit of, you know, procedure 101 that these MPs are getting to give them a sense of just how the House of Commons operates. Something as simple as staying in your seat when you vote. And I remember one of the MPs got out of her seat after she voted. She'd come from Nova Scotia, and she thought that that was the rules in Ottawa. And then I got out of my seat to go tell her to sit down while she was voting, and I immediately went back. And I stood up, and it caused quite a laugh in the House of Commons. But, you know, just sort of procedure 101, I hope that the MPs are getting that, because it would make the transition to the new role that much easier. It's not just running their offices.
Well, and it
The
sounds
other
like,
thing,
sure, go ahead, Michael.
there's early briefings, and Pam knows this world very well. The first briefings you often have, when you're receiving a new minister, and I think MPs get this increasingly, are about personal safety, cybersecurity, secure communications. Don't discuss sensitive matters on an open phone network. They could have used those briefings in Washington, apparently. Those are, you're entering a new world, and it's, there's a new environment that you and your family are stepping into. There also have to be some supportive briefings of family members, and very tough decisions for members from far away from Ottawa. Do I, leave the family home and shuttle back to see them? Do I bring family members to Ottawa? There's a lot of sorting out your personal life as well.
And Jared, can I just add on that? Sorry. On the security piece, I don't think these new MPs have any concept of the security that they're stepping into. So, for example, my office is in an office building chosen because, or was in an office building chosen because I couldn't find anything else, not for security reasons. But now, 10 years after I found that office, boy, was I glad I was in an office building. I don't know what kind of briefings they're giving new MPs on security, but just basic things like carrying their panic button with them, things that we don't want to talk about, but I think these new MPs need to be up to speed that it is, their security is very important, as is their staffs, and being able to support their staff who are at the front line of many security issues, and to make sure, and I don't think when you first get elected, you have any concept of the very real problems that MPs are facing right now.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Pam, because I know this is something that you've been reasonably vocal about over the years, and I think it fits in very well with the notion of what is happening right now and what needs to happen and what's going through the minds of those new MPs. As Michael, you pointed at, just things like my family's here, but I'm going to be working in a completely different city and in a different province, a lot of the time, and how do we organize those things? So a very challenging time for everyone concerned. Michael, I'm going to go to you now. So we have a new rookie PM, a cabinet, as we mentioned, that needs to be chosen, I understand, in days, and a country that is facing some serious challenges, as I mentioned earlier. And so there's a lot that the Prime Minister is promising to get done in the coming weeks. And I was just reading an article, actually, about all the things that are supposed to be happening even in June, things like meeting with the premiers, a throne speech, spending guidelines, a G7 summit. I mean, incredibly busy time for a new Prime Minister. So tell me, critical moment in time for this new government, and the bureaucrats are clearly working furiously behind the scenes, because part of that role is ensuring that there is that foundational support, and also making sure that the new Prime Minister knows what he has to do and what he has to put in place in order to meet some of the requirements, legislative requirements that are needed when it comes to governing. So tell me, briefly, but give me a sense, what's happening right now for those, for the bureaucrats behind the scenes as they try to help folks get ready for a new government?
Yeah, I prefer the term public servants, by the way, but
Yes.
most public servants are completely unaffected by this. They're out in Coast Guard ships and border stations and parks and laboratories, and they will wait and maybe be curious about who the minister is. there's a small sliver of people that are involved, particularly around PCO, which is the cabinet office helping the Prime Minister get sorted. If you're out in one of the departments like agriculture, you've fed into that process, in terms of they will have harvested your advice and briefings for the early days, but you'll be waiting for next week, no puff of smoke, but you'll find out who your minister is. You'll start the onboarding process, with a new minister, and away you go. Departments have known this was going to be an election year. It could have been in October. It turns out, it was a little faster. So people have been thinking about policy agendas for a while. And what you end up doing is the conversations are very iterative, and you're blending together. Here's the things in the platform, that have to be turned into decisions at the cabinet table and then delivered in laws, programs, regulations, taxes, and so on. A lot of the important decisions the Prime Minister's team will be making will be about sequence and order, what's important to go first, and where do we have more time, and so on. But as you alluded to, like, events just come pouring in. So the early priorities will include you're hosting the G7 meeting, so you can't just sort of coast and be a passenger. The most important meeting, in my view, is the NATO summit. Yeah, that is squarely going to put defense budgets and defense spending on the agenda and make the Minister of Finance's job really, really hard. So those, I remember when Mr. Trudeau came in, he had 4 international summits in the first 3 months. So that, there was a very strong international focus back in 2015 as well. But, then you blend the campaign commitments with, oh, there's all those bills that died on the order paper in January. Parliament hasn't sat since Christmas. Some of those bills have been aging quite a long time. Which ones do you want to keep? Which ones do you want to press forward with? Which ones do you want to modify? Which ones do you want to discard and leave to history? So sorting out the parliamentary agenda will take a fair bit of time and energy early. And then it's just everything from, here's some lawsuits you have to respond to, Auditor General chapters that have been piling up will all get tabled in a flurry, when Parliament comes back, and you'll have to have something to say about them. Any number of things just come crashing in and require decision, which is why, I started with your process for multitasking and handling these things. The bandwidth you have to cope with all the things really turns out to be important. And I think that the early days of a new government, and I saw 3 of them, you can start to feel overwhelmed. Oh my goodness, there are so many things I have to make the call on or make the decision on. But I think all new governments come in with a sense of energy, ambition, possibility. We're here, we're going to change things for the better. And there's a high level of energy and morale, whichever party is forming the government.
And excitement, as you're touching on. But you kind of mentioned this when you said it's key to get those right people into place, because, as you said, the bandwidth that is needed, as all these new things come in, is incredible. And as I mentioned earlier, the landscape is changing continually, more so now than I think in many previous decades. And so, main pitfall, from what I understand, for what you're saying, that a Prime Minister could make is possibly not choosing those right individuals to be leading some of these conversations and files. Would you agree? Is there something else they should be watching out for?
Well, I mean, you cannot know with certainty who your strongest players are going to be. You're going to make some dud hirings, as everybody always does. I made a few. Some of the people that come in as rookies grow incredibly quickly and become high performers very quickly, or they emerge later in your government. And you have to have a view on developing the roster, giving people jobs like committee chair, parliamentary secretary, having a bench you can go to later in your mandate if you're lucky enough to stay in power. So there's kind of that aspect to it. And then some of the people that have the great CVs and are identified by the journalists as an obvious star candidate turn out to be really struggling with the job and not very good at it. I'm not going to name names, but so we won't really know the sort of distribution of talent for about a year or two as people, cope with the jobs and develop. That's why there are often cabinet shuffles.
Exactly. Okay, I'm going to just hit pause here for a minute because some exciting news. As Kevin mentioned, there was some white puffs of smoke coming out from the Vatican, and now we understand that a new pope has been announced. The new pope is Robert Provost, a 69-year-old American cardinal from Chicago. And he was chosen, he has chosen the name Leo the 14th as his papal name. So this is really incredible news and something that I'm excited to share with all of you that have been wondering what's happening out there in the broader world, and certainly something that I think our audience will be wanting to hear about. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and maybe get to some other pieces of how we're doing. So there are transition teams involved right now, Pam, right? When this comes about, I mean, in some ways we're dealing with a prime minister. It's the same party, but it's his new team. So in some ways, we're going to have folks that were with the former government, you know, also some ministers who have experience, but then we're also going to be getting new folks in. Either of you want to talk about transition teams? What kinds of issues are they usually trying to solve, and how they help a prime minister navigate through these issues? Just very briefly, just to give us a sense of, we've talked a lot about some of those things that need to happen, but what kind of guidance will these transition teams, I understand, and it's been my experience, are a lot of times set up even before some of the major things start to happen.
Yeah, let me go really quickly. I worked with 3 of them. Interestingly, in the past, they were very public. You know, they published, you know, sort of media encounter and a group photo, and here's my transition team, and there was less mystery about it. They're usually somewhere between 7 and 12 people. It's a blend of people, key political advisors in the PM's closest circle of trust, you know, that they have good judgment. Some people with experience governing who've worked inside government, either in ministers' offices or PMO or former public servants, add something to the sort of implementation discussions. One of the really key people is whoever is, you know, given the job of vetting. Like there's somebody is given the job, sometimes 2 people, of vetting your potential ministers and saying, okay,
Yeah.
you know, Pam or Indira is a potential minister. Let's do the due diligence. Let's interview them. Let's see if they're, you know, how. If there are any things we need to know about. That's a really important role, you know, in the transition team environment. And they will have influence on, you know, crossing names off or pushing names to the fore in terms of choices and so on. You know, the art in this is the shorter the better. Like, you know, a successful transition is over fast. And then you're basically, you know, you've got a functional cabinet and a government, and parliament is recalled, and you're in the startup phase.
Fantastic.
And then Indira, just on that, each minister, the transition team is putting, you know, looking at the ministers, but don't forget there's a whole team that comes to the minister's side. So their chief of staff and everyone that's going to populate on the political side their offices. The minister's not going to be able to do very much if they don't have a team there as well. So getting that, you know, all the chiefs in place in all those ministers' offices, and you know, there's always turnover after an election of people that have been there for a long time. Which is good. You know, you bring new blood in, but you want to keep that experience in those ministers' offices and at PMO who have, you know, got the institutional knowledge, especially being in a minority government where those negotiations, you know, you see the least amount of turnover in the House Leader and the Whip's offices. Those staff tend to stay with the minister regardless of who's there. But those, I agree with Michael, those 2 positions are going to be key, and to see how long the government can function and how well it can function moving forward. So it's a big undertaking that they're doing right now.
And I'm so glad you brought that, because I've had to go through that and finding the right.
Do you let ministers pick their own people, or do you assign people to them? Is one of the sensitive issues I'm poking a stick into. There was a time in the mythical past where ministers sort of largely picked their own teams. The last 2 or 3 prime ministers have largely run it as a central personnel operation where they identify and recruit the political talent and assign them to particular ministers.
Yeah, And like I was saying, those are crucial roles, as Pam pointed out, and finding the right fit, for, as you said, the Prime Minister's office, but also that can work well with the minister in charge is key. Pam, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, because we're talking about ministers. Mark Carney is now figuring out who is going to be in those cabinet roles. We've heard it's going to be a slimmed down cabinet. We'll have to wait and see. But one of the things that the Prime Minister has made very clear is that, so you were the Vice Chair of the Status of Women Committee. Mark Carney has said he plans to stick with the former Prime Minister's gender parity role in Cabinet. Tell me, how important is this as we face this current landscape, that we have parity when it comes to gender in Cabinet?
I think it's critically important, Indira, and I will say he almost made it. He didn't quite have parity in the cabinet that he picked. The one thing I really hope he does this time is appoint a minister for women and gender equality. Indira, you held that role in Ontario. You know the important role that minister plays in cabinet. Just not see that position in the cabinet, for me personally, was a big disappointment. 300 women's groups signed a letter about that. So hopefully it's a full minister, not anything less than that. And, as we head into what are likely to be difficult economic times, we know that the rates of domestic violence and gender-based violence rises. Women are the first ones to lose their job when the economy is in a downturn. So having someone who's a full minister at the table is critically important, and ensuring that there's diversity around the cabinet table and gender parity. I think it's going to be more challenging for him because we had significantly fewer women run in this election. And in the last parliament, we had 33% representation of women in parliament. I suspect, although I haven't done an analysis of it, but I suspect that number will be down because the number of women running was down significantly, between 10 and 20%. So, if you have fewer women putting their names forward, I suspect, have fewer women who have been elected. But I do think it's critically important.
And I'm so glad you touched on some of those things. I mean, at the end of the day, women make up 50% of our population, and having their voice at the table is key. And I appreciate you bringing up the notion of having a minister with this responsibility and with this lens is key to coming up with good public policy that serves all Canadians, and has an eye on everything that affects Canadian families and so on. I mean, there is research out there, which I'm sure you're aware of, which actually shows that the lens that women leaders in particular bring to public policy and is slightly different, but really important when it comes to figuring out the priorities of a government. And let's talk about priorities then. I mean, Michael, a lot of serious issues that this government will have to deal with in the coming months and years: tariffs, threats to our country's sovereignty, housing shortages, immigration issues. There's been a lot that's been mentioned that's on the table. This is a minority, not a majority government. Tell me, how will these things, get priorities? How will this affect the government's ability to get things done? Just give us a sense of what sorts of things will need to be considered as we look at figuring out how to navigate through all these lots of multiple priorities.
Sure. I mean, let me start with the second one. I mean, I think the difference between minority and majority does tend to get overblown in the commentary, but it does have an impact. When you want to do something through legislation, there are lots of things governments do that don't involve legislation, and they'll be able to do that, including negotiate with the Americans. It's when you have to turn something into a law that you need to know that you've got 172 votes at your disposal. So we can talk about different ways to get that. Where it really plays out is in committees, where so much important work gets done. The government not only can't, I mean, let me pause and say, where it will affect the cabinet decisions is they can't do what they would do in a majority and assume that if they put a law before Parliament, it's going to come out the other end more or less the way they intended, give or take some amendments. In a minority parliament, you cannot be sure. You may lose control of the content, it may be blocked, it may be held up. And at the committee stage, if you don't have a working majority, and Pam knows this world better than I do, but you can't even control the pace, the witness lists, when things come to a vote, the kind of reports that committees give to give back. And in some cases, the opposition can take over the committee and start hostile hearings against the government, call the witnesses they want, and beat up on the government, which they wouldn't be able to do in a majority parliament. So it has a bearing, as does the dynamic with the Senate. Eventually you have to sort of find your way through the Senate approval as well. So I mean, that's really where it makes a difference. When things get to the sort of the escalation of passing a budget or not, and confidence test, and are we going to have an election? I'm not that worried that this government won't get at least 2 budgets and 2 parliamentary cycles in. But you can read that back to me next year and tell me how wrong I was. But the dynamics of the parliament, the day-to-day are, and I think Canadians will expect some across the aisle collaboration, log rolling, trading. I'll give you this amendment if you give me that, that kind of thing. So it's going to put a lot of actually, I think it's in some ways a good thing. It puts a lot of power in the hands of the MPs who are on committees. We pause there maybe with Pam if you'd like, and then come back to sort of the macro priority. Up to you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Pam, I know you have a lot of thoughts about committees and the important role they play. So please tell us from your perspective. Yeah.
I completely agree with Michael, though, that Canadians expect us, all the parties, to be working together right now. I think you've seen since the American president got elected and the whole annexation 51st state commentary, I don't remember in my lifetime Canadians coming together in the way that they have. I know I do it when I go grocery shopping, and I'll look at 2 bags of apples. If one is product of Canada, that's the bag I'm buying. And I'm not the only one doing that, right? So we've seen this unity in Canada, which is wonderful. I think Canadians, much like we saw at the very, very beginning of COVID, where all the parties put partisanship aside and stood together, I think Canadians are expecting the parties. They don't want to see silly partisan games in the House of Commons. They want to see the parties standing together to deal with the US. Having said that, though, committees are going to be particularly challenging this time because there will be no NDP members on the committees. So you're only going to have Conservative and Bloc members on the committee. And that means that when you're trying to, whether it's a study or particularly when you're doing legislation, it's depending on the numbers that they end up putting on the committees, it's possible that you could have the opposition control the amendments. The NDP, and I worked really well with a number of NDP members, but they work very differently than the NDP did. And so you're not going to have the Bloc and the NDP to make agreements with on committee. And unfortunately, what can happen with that is that if there are too many changes made that the government doesn't agree with, it makes it not only awkward for the government, but depending on the bill, they may decide not to bring it back to Parliament if it's not one of the priority pieces of legislation. I mean, I did a bill on aid to Afghanistan when I was there. And I was very fortunate, to be honest with you, that I had a Conservative member work with me who was willing to wait to get changes made and get approvals because he ended the Bloc in particular, wanted to see that bill get passed. It could have just ended up dying on the order paper if there hadn't been cooperation there. So I think navigating committees is going to be an especially difficult challenge, and one that I hope that the government prioritizes and encourages their MPs to reach across the aisle and make, develop relationships with those opposition members that are on the committees with them so that they can work collaboratively.
Such good advice and really some great observations about things. I've actually had to present to committees on the federal level before, and was surprised at times by just the, you're touching on how partisanship can really come out there. And so while you're, as someone who's had to present and you're giving your sense of what is happening in a certain area, and meanwhile, the questions coming at you are very specific and with a very clear focus. It's daunting, and I appreciate both of you talking about the fact that Canadians are at a point now where there's an expectation that is so much on the table when it comes to the future of our country and the success of our country that we need to pull these things together and make the battleground, recognize that the battleground shouldn't be necessarily with each other, but we need to focus.
Can I just add something, Indira, that committees, yeah. I've seen committees work incredibly well together and produce incredibly great reports that ended up, mental health of public safety officers is one I'm particularly proud of, that ended up becoming part of the minister's policies, and it became part of the budget. Committees, I used to say that it would be nice if Canadians could watch committee meetings rather than question period, because they'd actually see collaboration. What I don't want to see in this session of Parliament is, again, committees being used for social media clips, where it's no longer working for the best of Canadians. It's being used to generate social media clips to get likes, and that is completely unproductive. And so I really hope that we can use committees to do what they're designed to do, which is good work. And when you have those different ideas at the table, you get incredibly, really powerful reports. And I've seen opposition improved legislation as well. I remember Elizabeth May bringing an amendment to a piece of firearms legislation because she was the Green Party. She couldn't get it in, and I worked with her to include her amendment in the bill. So when you're working together across party lines, I think you come up with far better legislation and reports. But committees can't be used for clip factories for social media. They need to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
There is a possibility in the Senate, though. One of the most influential policy reports of the last 30 years came from Senate studies. And there's also the possibility of, you can't do it for everything, but a number of pieces of legislation, you can start in the Senate and sort of debug them and hear from people and then send them to the House. It doesn't always have to be House first, Senate second.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, that the Senate could wind up playing a very important and vital role in the conversations about what next and how we shape policy in these challenging times. And just, I have to ask, either of you if you have a comment about this, because we're talking about committees, but we're also talking about a new complex relationship with the US. I mean, our Prime Minister was just down there trying to navigate through a sort of meet and greet and a conversation, and the entire country's eyes were on it, it seems to me. How do you feel this new complex relationship, let's call it, may play out in terms of committee work or other things, as the government tries to implement various pieces, moving forward? Any thoughts? Just open to whether or not you have something to add to this.
This is a reality for another decade, so there'll be many webinars to come. We're never going back to the world before Christmas and before Trump. We've got 1,200 days of Trump left, and you can imagine how chaotic that's going to be. Possibly succeeded by Vance or Rubio. The Republican Party has become isolationist. Fox News and their sort of are training a lot of Americans that Canada is some hostile socialist neighbor. That toothpaste isn't going back in the tube to sort of, so we're fundamentally, I think the Prime Minister got it right, whether it's the economy, security, intelligence sharing, environment, brain drain, and we are in a new world, and that's going to ripple through all kinds of issues. You asked me a long time ago about sort of immediate priorities, and they're kind of Trump, Trump, and Trump. It's Trump and trade, Trump and defense, Trump and northern security, northern sovereignty, and so on. So unfortunately, we're very much going to be kind of zigzagging and navigating. And so the challenge for the new government is to have a compass of where they want to go. And as you zigzag, stay on course and try to make progress on the agenda they laid out for Canadians. But that's going to require an enormous amount of agility and nimbleness and the ability to kind of, while you're dealing with the latest Trump crisis, somebody is working hard on healthcare, on housing, on immigration, on clean energy, and so on. So you have to sort of have a government capable of multitasking and crisis management at the same time. So that's a lot to ask.
Well,
And I
just
think,
really quickly, sorry, go ahead, Pam. Yes,
no, I was just
sorry.
going to say having really competent ministers in the key roles, I think is going to be really important, because if the Prime Minister can trust his Minister of Public Safety and his, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to be able to do their role without micromanaging them, it will give him and the Prime Minister's office the ability to deal with these. With Trump, we do have other priorities. Housing and affordability are certainly major issues that Canadians expect us to deal with. So putting really strong people and strong staff in those roles or in those ministries, I think is going to be critical. And Michael had mentioned NATO before. One of the things I'm really hoping the government does is take a look at what we include in our NATO commitment. My understanding is the US includes their investments in nuclear energy, medical isotopes, the Coast Guard. We don't include any of those in what we include in our NATO commitment, is my understanding. Taking a look at if there aren't things that would be acceptable to the United States, like nuclear energy, and including it in it. I mean, energy is a security issue now. There's no doubt about it, especially since the war in Ukraine, where energy from Russia is no longer acceptable. So sort of maybe taking a broader look at what we're including in our NATO commitment to be able to reach that 2% that we all want to reach without it necessarily being financial commitments as well. I saw Michael kind of go like this. I don't know if he agrees with me on that, but
I do agree with you, except what counts is how NATO counts it. We can assert what we want. It's how NATO Secretariat counts it. The commitment is very likely to go to at least 3% of GDP at the June summit. 3% of the Canadian GDP is $90 billion a year, and the government spends about $450 right now on everything. So this is the biggest headache, I think, and for the finance minister and the government is, are we going to try to get to those targets? Are we going to try to get to them faster? And then, as Pam says, a whole bunch of policy decisions about how, like, where are we going to invest? Which capabilities? What's important? What are we going to buy? Where are we going to bulk up and so on? Is it about fighter jets or warships or drones or satellites? And we can only count the Coast Guard if we give them a more militarized and armed role. Is that something we want to do? It's a controversial subject. So we're just at the beginning of a lot of really complicated decisions. It's very easy, as Mr. Poilievre got it down to sound bites, and Mr. Carney got it down to some paragraphs in the platform. Turning them into laws, policies, spending priorities is going to be tough. And I think the sequencing is really hard because people have made a very good case for renewal. Don't waste a crisis. Now is the time for a big spending review. Now is the time for fundamental tax reform. Now is the time to redo our regulation. Now is our time to rethink federal provincial transfers. We cannot do all of that at the same time. We just don't have the bandwidth, either in the political side or the public service side. So I think, to go back to like one of your questions a while ago, the most important decisions Mr. Carney's team will have to make now are really about sequencing and, this is urgent, this one we can harvest in the fall, this one's for next year's budget, and try to control the pace of governing. And of course, you never completely control it because a lac megantic comes around or a terrorist attack or whatever, and you're very quickly into sort of reactive issue management government. So staying on course on with all these challenges is going to be really, really hard. I'm not a pessimist on that. I think it's doable, and I think there's a level of ambition and permission from Canadians, as Pam said. It's probably possible to get out of incrementalism, get out of some of the sort of straitjackets we're in on some of the policies, and with a bit of bold leadership and a willingness to do some things that will ultimately be controversial, I think the government really can get off to a pretty solid start.
Some really fantastic comments here in so many different ways. I mean, Michael, you're saying, it's going to be hard to be nimble and still do foundational reviews at the same time while the landscape and the environment is changing and things are coming at you. And Pam, your comments about, let's think about what other ways, what other pieces we may have at our fingertips that we can use to try to get to the places we need to get to in order to have the agreements that are going to be so important for our future. And let's consider all the tools we may have in the box, and not necessarily focus at times on things that we may not be able to deliver on. And so really great observations. We are going to be running out of time shortly, so I'm going to have to go to some questions that are coming in. But before that, I'm going to ask both of you very quickly. I know it's not fair, but we have to do it. These are the constraints and these are the realities we're dealing with. But both of you touched on this a little bit, but I would like to pull it out of you a little bit more. So facing complex challenges, no question, but often out of increasing challenges. And one of my favorite sayings is, out of these challenging situations are also opportunities. Sometimes we get so focused on the problems that we can't see how this space may be creating an opportunity or something over here that could work really well for our country. So to both of you, what opportunities do you see this government thinking or should be thinking about pursuing in the wake of these challenges, or could be thinking about focusing on when it comes to transforming the economy, our global alliances, uniting Canadians? Those are just some thoughts, but really it's up to you. Are there opportunities out there that we should be thinking about that perhaps we haven't focused on?
Yeah, and Deirdre, you touched on all of those, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but I'm going to use an example that hasn't been in the media, and it's health research. I'm so impressed with what Princess Margaret has done almost immediately to say, if you're not happy in the US as a researcher because of cuts, and please come and join us. And I know that there have been US researchers and scientists, brilliant people who've come to Canada. But we can't rely on the US for this any longer. And so making sure that we're continuing to invest in health research here in Canada so that we have our own data, that we have the foundation here in our country to be able to support things going forward. I had a doctor from Mount Sinai tell me that the US has gone back 50 years in their science because of the cuts that have been made. So it's an opportunity. There's a number of areas on medical isotopes. There's an opportunity for Canada to be, continue to be the leader in the world, but really seize that space. There's so many opportunities that are just, let's seize these opportunities in select areas where we're already a leader. And as Michael said, the toothpaste isn't going back in the tube. And let's seize these opportunities, especially when it comes to, we're a small country, and we need to remember that, but we also punch way above our weight in so many areas. Let's find those areas and really seize them and grow them, and have the world look to Canada for leadership in whether it's foreign affairs or so many other areas. There are amazing opportunities for us right now, and it's not the first time that Canada has shown the ability to lead the world.
Really good thoughts. And you point something, really important, which is that we have a good global reputation and a good, strong reputation out there. And let's look at that. Please go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, just a number of points to reinforce. We bring a lot of assets. We're stronger than a lot of Canadians think. We're a $3 trillion economy. We have a lot going for us in terms of an educated labor force. We have presence in all the leading edge sort of technologies and industries. So there's enormous economic advantage. And we're good at diversity and governance and things that are starting to fall apart in other places. And that will make us relatively well positioned. Second point would be, to reinforce the window of permission to tackle some things in new ways, whether it's housing, immigration, healthcare, wait times, any number of issues. Just two quick commercials for, maybe for future conversations. This could be the parliament that repeals the Indian Act. Like, that's available to us if the political will is there on both sides. And my personal sort of crusade is to make public service reform and state reform part of the agenda, not try to meet all of these with a public service that's running on 1990 software, but as the Starmer government has done, to make a progressive vision of a modern state actually part of the agenda. That's a hard slog. It'll take a couple of years and they'll run into a lot of resistance inside and outside the public service, but I would make state reform part of the agenda. In a nutshell, Mr. Carney has a once in a generation window to do serious, positive, constructive public service reform, and I hope he doesn't pass it up.
And thank you for
Indira, Michael?
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I know we're short on time. It's just Michael brought up the Indian Act, and Indigenous peoples received very little dialogue during the campaign, but there are a number of MPs, new MPs who've been elected who themselves are Indigenous. And, we did a lot. I'm proud of what we did as a government, but I don't want to see this become something that's not a priority for the government. And I think there's just so many opportunities for the government to make sure that repealing the Indian Act, my goodness, wouldn't that be amazing? And if we could really transformationally walk that road of reconciliation when it comes to so many issues, Indigenous women in corrections is something that I've been concerned about for years. There's an opportunity, and I'm really glad Michael brought it up, because it hasn't been talked about a lot at all during the campaign, and we can't lose sight of that as a priority.
Absolutely. And what you're saying is, as we're putting out all these fires that are coming up, let's not forget the business of what, governing is all about when it comes to Canadians and our broader needs. And Michael, I just wanted to say, I'm glad you touched on that a little bit. We're running out of time, but I know, as Canada's former top bureaucrat, you're someone who has called for some major structural overhauls of the federal government. You touched on it briefly. We don't really have time to go into it, but I appreciate the fact that you are again putting it as something that should be on the agenda at some point, because at the end of the day, if we're going to be nimble, we need to be able to take care of some of these issues and some of these problems. Maybe try to go very quickly. The questions have been coming in, and we've actually touched on some of them. One of the questions was, is there any indication of support for science and technology research? I think, Pam, you touched on the notion that this is a really important time when it comes to innovation and research. And certainly, I know I'm in the post-secondary sector right now. Innovative research is key, and there are lots of folks out there in the world that are looking to Canada and wanting to contribute and wanting to come here and assist and support in some of the work that's going on. So that was one of the questions. I'm going to go right now to this next question, and quickly, folks, because we just have to wrap up. So brief answer here. Do you think the PMO has learned any lessons regarding managing caucus dynamics? And do you think it will be harder for individual MPs to advocate for issues? Anyone want to take that, Pam?
Well, I'll say it's a new Prime Minister and a new PMO staff, so I think that we'll see what happens. I honestly don't know, but I think it has to be a priority, and time will tell. But I think it needs to. It's a new team there, so I think caucus relations, if this government is going to be successful, they need to do that well.
Michael?
Yeah, I think every government starts with every prime minister has started saying they're going to make cabinet more of a cabinet, and they're going to do better on caucus relations, and they probably will for a while. I think the test is, after a year or two or three, there's a tendency of governments to kind of, retreat into a more closed circle and a bubble, and you really have to fight against that tendency. It's a gravitational pull that all governments have to fight against. I'd just say quick advice to the audience: watch for the budget. The budget is 10 times more important from the speech from the throne. That's when you really put your money where your slogans are. That'll tell you the priorities of the government. And, in terms of the summitry, the NATO summit is way more important than the G7.
Well, I see Kevin's joined us. This has been fantastic. I've actually learned a lot. We should grab a coffee and continue this conversation at some point, all of us. But Kevin, I'm happy to turn it over to you. I apologize to our audience if I didn't get to all of the questions, but our panel was just remarkable and had so much insight. And I apologize for interrupting some folks here and there, but it was a great conversation. Over to you, Kevin.
I think that was a fantastic conversation. So I want to thank you, Indira, for leading the conversation. I definitely want to thank Michael and Pam for sharing your thoughts and insights. I learned a heck of a lot. We may have to do this again when we learn more about what the new government actually puts on the table in terms of machinery of government and priorities and whatnot. So thank you very much for that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for what will be a number of these webinars that we do throughout the year. I should mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we've announced our upcoming major Pearson Laureate dinner that's taking place in Ottawa on June 11th. This year we'll be honoring the Honorable Irwin Cotler, former Minister of Justice, legendary human rights champion. So if you're planning to be in Ottawa in June, we would love to have all of you plan to be there. So thank you very much for everyone for participating, and thank you for everyone who joined us today for our webinar. If you want to review this, we'll put it on our social media channels, put it on our YouTube channel so that people can review it later. But thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.